Hello everybody, and welcome to Attack of the Grey Pile. Today I will be showing you how I like to paint my Kronos Hive Fleet Terminids using a Termagaunt as an example. So let's get to it and dive right in. As you can see, I've already primed the model in a black primer. This is to serve as a base layer for the rest of the paint to attach to, as well as serving as a base color for me to build off of, as the Kronos Hive Fleet is a red armor on black skin tone. Most of the painting I will be doing today for the skin will be dry brush. For this first layer I'm using Eshin Gray. This is going to be a middle tone between my base color black and some of the brighter tones of grays that I'm going to be using later to help enhance that realism and create depth on the model and really push it over the top. This next layer you're going to see me apply here is Mechanicus Standard, which will serve as a mid-tone between that Eshin Gray that we just applied and the next layer, which will be Dawnstone Gray. Now this will help tie the bright tones of Dawnstone down to the darker tones of Eshin Gray, and this will serve to help keep the color change from being so abrupt and jarring on the model. For the last gray, I will be applying Dawnstone Gray, and I'll be using this e.l.f. makeup brush, specifically the smudge brush. It was only a couple dollars at Walmart, and I find that these work very well at picking out those raised sections of the model and transfer just enough paint to draw those raised details to the eye. Now that we've finished painting the skin, I'm going to proceed to paint the carapace of this Tyranid. I will be using a Mephiston Red watered down as a base color to help build up that brighter red tone over time and make it really pop. Always remember to trace the edges of your armor. I understand we want to try and paint these quickly, but at the same time, we want to try and make them look good too, right? Moving on to the scales, you can see that I'm starting by applying the paint closer to the center of the scale and then working my way outwards. That's so that then I don't accidentally spill the paint off the side of the armor and onto the skin that I've already painted. You can always go back and touch it up, but it's best not to mess it up in the first place. Here I'm going back over the lower leg so that then the opacity of the red is where I like it. Remember, you can always turn the model over to ensure that you get as much paint coverage on the surface as possible. It's always best to ensure that you paint as much of the model as you can, rather than leaving a bald spot that may show up later when you're using it or putting it on display. Now, as I start painting up the other side of this model, you can see the opacity differences of the paint when it's wet versus when it's dry. This is something you should always take into consideration when you're painting, just so that then you understand how your paint behaves while it's wet and while it's dry, and you have an understanding of how it will set up once you've completed your painting process. Now, as I get to the top of the shoulder, you can see that I'm starting to tie all these surfaces together and try to make a more uniform coverage of red across these panels. This carapace is supposed to resemble something similar to crab shell or maybe even conch shell, so it will have a bit of color variation within it, but at the same time I want to be realistic within the shade of red and its variations. Now here on the head, you can see I'm starting by laying the paint at the crest of these panels and dragging it outwards, as I don't want this paint to run. Doing so will protect the paint that we've already laid down for this skin tone. I will continue to drag this paint from the center to the edge all the way down the back of the head carapace until I have the coverage that I think I want on this mini. So there's the majority of the base coat of Mephiston Red on the carapace. Now we want to take our time and go back and see if there's any spots that we missed now, because if we don't do that and we find spots we missed later, it's much more difficult to go back and paint them. For this next layer of paint, I will be dry brushing on Evil Sun's Scarlet. This paint will serve the same purpose as the brighter grays that we used on the skin to help emphasize those raised details and add depth to the model. Note how I'm dry brushing backwards up the back and leg armor so that the paint makes most contact on the raised edge to the rear of the armor plate. For this next layer of paint, I will be dry brushing on Evil Sun's Scarlet. This paint will serve the same purpose as the brighter grays that we used on the skin to help emphasize those raised details and add depth to the model. Note how I'm dry brushing backwards up the back and leg armor so that the paint makes most contact on the raised edges. Now it's time that we get to highlight the eyes and the subdermal layers, as well as the sections exposed in the weapon. My plan here is to base in white and then go over the top of this white with a contrast paint, which will serve as a stark contrast to really draw out these surfaces against the muted and subtle tones of the skin and armor. Now it's time to paint the carapace on the weapon. Following the same recipe as before for the carapace, I will be using Mephiston Red as the base coat, but instead of dry brushing, I will use a technique called edge highlighting, where you use the side of the brush to pick out the raised edges of the surface you are painting, as dry brushing in such a tight, confined space is not exactly feasible. At this point now, I'm going to start tracing out the outer edges of some of the other armor plates on the model with edge highlighting and that scarlet red to help emphasize that bright edge that I'm really trying to achieve on these plates. Now it's time to paint the teeth and tongue of this Termagaunt. The plan here is to base in white and then go over again with a contrast. Here I'm starting to go back over the skin tone, as I've noticed that during the dry brushing process some of the red has spilled over onto the skin. Now it is not my intent to knock this skin tone all the way back down to a uniform gray, but to help knock down some of the red to appear as though it's reflecting off of the armor plates on this Termagaunt. This will help to add realism and depth to the model, as most light would reflect off of such a hard surface such as the carapace. Now the moment I've been waiting for, the contrast paint. The name of the paint I'll be using is Tyranid Turquoise. Now, the way this works is it's almost like an ink. It wants to sink into the recesses of the model, and those recesses will become darker, whereas the raised edges will become brighter. You'll see it as I'm laying this on the white, how the ribs within that surface really begin to stand out against the surrounding area of the model. Now when it comes to painting the eyes and the open sections of the weapon, I will be using a contrast by the name of Kroxigor Scales. It's brighter than the turquoise, and I wanted it to really make it look like the weapon and the eyes were glowing, and give it that sort of fantasy feral monster sort of appearance. Now for the teeth, I'm going over the white with Agrak's Earthshade. That will really take the brightness off the white, give it a dark, muddy, yellow sort of tinge. Something you would really expect on a creature like this. At this point you might be thinking this mini is done, and you could easily be forgiven for thinking that, but in all honesty, I feel like we could take it a notch further by going over the model with Nuln Oil. What this will do is it'll help exaggerate the details on this model and push it to the next level. You can see I'm touching up the turquoise section on the legs. Some Nuln Oil had dropped in there. Now to clean this up while it's still wet, all you have to do is wet your brush with clean water and go into the recess and wash out the unwanted Nuln Oil or Agrax Earthshade. As soon as it dries though, it will require more work to clean it up. At this point with the Nuln Oil, I'm simply putting it where I feel the details are maybe a little subdued, and I'd like the Nuln Oil to try and exaggerate the detail in those areas. Once that's done, we can go ahead and start working on the base. For the sake of brevity, I'm going to remove the model while it's still wet. Usually I would advise waiting until the paint is finished drying. You see that I have a hard time trying to pull the model out of the base because it's wet, so I actually attack it from the bottom using a set of side cutters to push the pin of the model out from the base so that then I can set the model aside and work on the base and prepare it for paint. As you can see, I have glued down a grass tuft to add variety to the base and try and help tell a story behind the model, as I'd like to try and have some variation between my minis when I put them on the table. I am tracing around the grass tuft with a craft knife so that I can break free all the loose grass tuft fibers and make it look more realistic. Now I'm swapping out the intended base for a blank base topped with blue tack. The blue tack will hold on to the intended base and allow me to paint the entire perimeter of the rim after I paint the top surface. For the top of the base, what I am using is a texture paint known as Sterland Mud from Citadel. It has granules in it that help make it look like realistic dirt and debris on the surface of the base. You can use a flat synthetic brush or even a small craft spatula to help spread this paint across the surface. For the rim, I'm painting it in Castellan Green. Now I'm trying to move quickly so that I can still keep the top surface paint wet. This will come into play later when I reintroduce the mini to the base, as it will help tie the figure to the surrounding terrain and make it look more like one piece in a story. Now we can finally reintroduce the mini to the base. I'm going to make sure its forward foot is in the grass, crushing it down so it actually ties in and looks as if it's running across the scene. And after all that work, this Termagaunt is finished and shall set the standard for the rest of the force. And that concludes our video on how to paint the Kronos Hive Fleet Termagaunt. If you would like to see more, please let me know. Send me a comment or hit a like, even subscribe. I plan to do a video probably once a week for the smaller stuff and maybe once a month for the larger projects. I would very much appreciate your feedback and support in this. This has been a project that I've been putting aside for a very long time, and I finally decided it's time for me to start doing this. I truly appreciate all of you, and I hope you have a wonderful day.